It's been a week of high drama in the Brexit process, with votes in the British Parliament to reject the withdrawal deal for a second time, rule out a no-deal Brexit and seek an extension to the process from the European Union. Ireland is the EU member state which will be most affected by the UK leaving, not only because of its open border with Northern Ireland, but also its close political and economic ties to its nearest neighbour. My guest today is Simon Coveney, Ireland's Deputy Prime Minister, Tánaiste in the Irish language, and also the Minister for Foreign Affairs and Trade. Thank you very much for coming in to speak to us.
Oh, thank you for having me.
What do you make of the developments we've seen in Brexit in Westminster in recent days on Brexit?
Well, certainly, this week was a big turning point. First of all, we had the high drama building up to whether or not the British Parliament would ratify the withdrawal agreement. And of course, the EU, through Jean-Claude Juncker and Michel Barnier, had worked hard with the British Prime Minister and her team to try to provide the reassurance and the clarification that they hoped would be enough to get this deal across the line. It didn't turn out that way. And so the British Parliament rejected the withdrawal agreement for a second time. But following on from that, I think the British Parliament made a very emphatic statement the following night in rejecting a no-deal Brexit. In other words, a crash out without any management or plan by a majority of 43, which is quite a big majority these days in Westminster. And then the day after that, the British Prime Minister made it clear that, look, she would next week put a choice to Parliament, which she described as a pretty stark choice, in the context of applying for an extension of Article 50, which is pushing back the date before which the UK plan to leave the European Union. And the choice would be this, that if the Parliament can ratify the withdrawal agreement next week, before that request goes to the EU Leaders Summit, well, then she will seek a technical and short extension of Article 50, probably up until the end of June. If the British Parliament can't ratify a deal next week, then she will need to seek a much longer extension of Article 50 to give the UK and its Parliament the time and space to effectively recalibrate and look at their approach to Brexit as a whole.
So do you think that is no-deal Brexit off the table now? Do you think there's still any risk that the UK could crash out without a deal?
Well, it's still a possibility because the legal default position today is that Britain leaves on the 29th of March at 11 p.m. that night, and there is no deal in place. So technically, in order to prevent that from happening, something else needs to be agreed. But next week, the expectation is that the British Prime Minister will make, depending on the decision of her Parliament, will make a request either for a short technical extension of Article 50 on the basis of agreeing a deal and ratifying a deal in Westminster, but because she needs more time to pass the legislation that's consistent with that deal before they leave, or else she will make a request for a much longer extension of Article 50, which I think a lot of EU leaders will be questioning of, because of course they will want to understand that if there's a long extension asked for, they'll want to know the purpose for that and how Britain intends on finding a way to get a deal that is good for Britain, but also recognises the priorities that the EU has too, in terms of protecting its own single market, its own customs union, and all of the other things that the EU has been adamant about during these negotiations.
And what would convince the Irish government to support a longer extension? What sort of what sort of promises would need to be made by Theresa May?
Well, I think in truth the Irish government won't really be an obstacle here to an extension request. We recognise Ireland probably understands British politics better than any other country in the European Union. Britain and Ireland in many ways are intertwined economically, politically, family ties and so on. It's a very, very close relationship. We share the island of Ireland together. Northern Ireland is of course part of the United Kingdom. We have a shared responsibility in terms of the peace process there. We're both co-guarantors of that agreement, which is just over 20 years old, which of course has been a big challenge in the context of the Brexit negotiations in terms of how do we protect that peace process? How do we keep an open border which reinforces the normality that you enjoy today on the island of Ireland in comparison to 20 years ago when the border was such a source of division? But no, I mean, I think, the Irish issues linked to Brexit, I think, are very clear. They are EU issues now too. I think the UK understand that, as do all of our partners across the EU. But we won't be an obstacle to an extension. But I think there are many EU leaders who will want to have a clear plan that goes with that request for an extension of whether it's 9 months or 21 months or whatever the ask is.
And what do you think that they'll be looking for? Were they looking for a promise of, another referendum, an election? Will that be the sort of event that will have to be there for those EU leaders to agree to a longer extension?
I don't think the outcome will be clear in the context of a longer extension. I think it'll be a process that the British government will need to bring forward, probably offering indicative votes to their parliament in terms of trying to get majority consensus on the way forward, and then time to be able to enact that. And we don't know what direction that will take, to be honest. And really that is a matter for the British government to come forward with a persuasive argument as to a request for more time that can allow Britain as a country, but also the British Parliament, to find more consensus around their approach to Brexit, because they have found it very, very difficult to do that to date.
You've been meeting France's Europe Minister while you've been here in Paris. Do you get an impression that the French too would support an extension to the Brexit process?
Well, I mean, I think President Macron has been quite firm on this issue, that if there is a request for a long extension, he will want to see the purpose of that, a plan to go with that, to chart a new way forward. And I don't think that's an unreasonable request. And certainly I think the British Prime Minister, to get agreement in her own parliament as well as to get agreement amongst other EU leaders, will want to actually put a clear proposal as to how Britain would use that extra time to be able to, first of all, find agreement within the United Kingdom for the kind of Brexit that they're looking for, but also obviously to get agreement with their EU partners
during the process,
to be able to do that as well.
During the process up until this point, there's been so much focus on the question of the border guarantees in Ireland, the border between Ireland and Northern Ireland, the so-called backstop. It was the issue that Theresa May was sent back to the European Union to look for more assurances on. Has that issue now gone away for what's happening in Westminster? It doesn't seem to have the same focus it did before this week.
Well, look, I mean, that's a matter for the Westminster system. But, we worked hard with Michel Barnier and his task force to try to provide reassurances to the UK. The British Prime Minister asked for legal reassurances, if you like, and legal change to the package that was being proposed in terms of ratification. She got that. She got a very strong legal instrument which committed the EU to really explore alternatives to the backstop and set out a timetable for that, and also to provide a lot of reassurance that everybody would work to avoid the backstop being used in the first place, and if it ever was needed in terms of it, if it was ever triggered, that it would be temporary. But for some that wasn't enough. But look, I think there are a lot of conversations taking place over this weekend between the government and other elements that support the government to try to find a way through on this issue. But, from our perspective, Ireland and the EU together have been very consistent in relation to protecting a peace process on the island of Ireland. Part of that is an obligation that we all have to maintain a seamless border between the two jurisdictions because of the symbolism of that, but also the practical realities of it. We have a functioning all-island economy at the moment that reinforces a positive peace process, and we need to keep it that way. And I think Theresa May recognises that, and that is why she's also trying to get this deal across the line.
Last summer you described the prominent Brexiteer MP, Jacob Rees-Mogg, as being ill-informed about Northern Ireland, the border that was happening there. Do you feel that there are politicians in Westminster that have taken the border issue and made it something that it wasn't to begin with, that are using it for their own political gains in this process?
Yes. I think that some have turned the backstop into this political monster that it never was meant to be and doesn't need to be. And the facts don't bear that out. So just for your audience, effectively what the backstop is a last resort mechanism. or an insurance mechanism. In other words, if we cannot find a way of solving the border challenge on the island of Ireland through a comprehensive future relationship deal, and if there aren't technological ways of solving this problem, well, then the default or fallback position is what's called a backstop, which is an agreement that the UK would maintain regulatory alignment with the rules of the European Union's customs union and single market in the areas necessary to prevent physical border infrastructure between those two jurisdictions on the island of Ireland. And that agreement effectively has been in place with the British government since December 2017, but long before the withdrawal agreement was signed off on. But it became formalised, if you like, as an agreement within the withdrawal agreement. So this is, the irony of this. And unfortunately, some have turned it into a constitutional issue for the United Kingdom, which it was never and is never about. This is about practical regulatory coordination and cooperation to prevent the need for border checks and the security operation that would be required to facilitate those, which everybody is trying to avoid.
And has the Anglo-Irish relationship been damaged as a result of this?
In some ways, trying to find a solution to this very difficult challenge has brought individuals together, but certainly it has caused a lot of strain and forced a lot of polarisation on politics in Northern Ireland in particular, which is a place that could really do without that. We have a peace deal called the Good Friday Agreement or the Belfast Agreement that's 21 years old this year. That has created an absence of violence and terrorism in Northern Ireland, which everybody welcomes. But we need to keep working on reinforcing that peace to try to bring about real reconciliation in Northern Ireland, which isn't there yet. And unfortunately, the Brexit effect on Northern Ireland has been to polarise political parties, to reinforce this sense of defensive identity, if you like, as opposed to encouraging communities to reach out to each other. And that's why it's so important that as part of this Brexit challenge, we overcome the Northern Ireland issues, the border issues, so that we can allow Northern Ireland to continue to progress on the road of reconciliation following a peace process, which, of course, has been such a big priority for the Irish government throughout this process. And to be fair to the Prime Minister herself, I think this has also been a big priority for her to try to get agreement on. But unfortunately, some people in her parliament have decided to try to twist this issue into something that it's not.
Okay, Simon Coveney, Ireland's Deputy Prime Minister, thank you very much for joining us on France 24. Thank you to you for watching. Do stay with us on France 24. The latest news headlines on the way next.
Take a new look at the news. Eyewitness accounts from those at the heart of the action, all over the world. Exclusive videos you've never seen before, all verified by our journalists.
The Observers, presented by Derek Thompson on France 24 and France24.com.